My wife betrayed me with a lawyer who dragged her into the criminal world. I refused his schemes, and his men beat me up. I changed my first and last name to get revenge. Brandon Hayes had never imagined his life would take such a dark turn. He had spent years building his career as a meticulous financial analyst, and his marriage to Alexis Reed had started out with promise. They lived in a quiet suburb of Colorado, seemingly content. But beneath the surface, things were starting to crack. Alexis had begun coming home late, brushing off his questions with vague answers about work and a new colleague. Rumors began to swirl among their friends, and while Brandon trusted her, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. It wasn't until the day of the attack that everything came crashing down. Brandon had returned home from a business trip, expecting a quiet evening with Alexis. Instead, he was greeted by a nightmare. Nathan Bell, a powerful and dangerous lawyer who had recently entered Alexis's life, was waiting for him. Brandon had no idea how deep Alexis had gotten into Nathan's world of criminal activity, but when he refused to cooperate with their demands, they made an example of him. Nathan and his goons beat Brandon mercilessly, leaving him barely clinging to life. The last thing he saw before losing consciousness was Alexis standing over him, her face a mask of indifference. When Brandon woke up, he was in a hospital bed, his head wrapped in thick bandages and his body riddled with pain. His mind was foggy, and he struggled to piece together what had happened. The room was dimly lit, and the only sound was the steady beep of the heart monitor beside him. As he blinked away the confusion, he noticed two figures at the foot of his bed, a tall man wearing a worn cowboy hat and a petite woman standing next to him. "He's got potential, but he's not ready," the man muttered in a low voice. The woman responded, "He can be trained, the body can learn, and the skills can be acquired. We don't have much time. They'll come for him soon." Brandon tried to sit up, his heart racing with confusion and fear. "Who are you?" he rasped, his voice weak and hoarse. The woman stepped forward, her face still obscured by the shadows. "We're here to help you," she said calmly, "but you need to understand the danger you're in. Alexis isn't who you think she is." "What do you mean?" Brandon croaked, his throat dry. His mind was swirling with questions, but the pain in his head was unbearable. The woman glanced at the man beside her, who nodded. She turned back to Brandon. "Your wife, Alexis, has been involved with Nathan Bell for months. She's deeply embedded in his criminal operations. They attacked you because you wouldn't help them with their financial schemes." Brandon's heart sank as the memories of the attack flooded back. Nathan's cold, calculated words, the brutal blows to his body, and Alexis standing by, doing nothing to stop them. Why didn't she stop them?" he whispered. "She's not the woman you married," the man in the cowboy hat said bluntly. "She's gone too far down the rabbit hole, and now she's a part of their world. You were in the way." Tears welled up in Brandon's eyes, but he fought them back. He wanted to believe it wasn't true, that Alexis had been coerced, or that there was some misunderstanding. But deep down, he knew the truth. She had betrayed him, and now, his life was in ruins. "Who are you?" Brandon asked again, more forcefully this time. The woman stepped into the light, revealing herself. She was petite, with sharp features and an air of authority. "I'm Dr. Emily Rivers," she said, "and this is Eli Davis. We've been watching over you, waiting for the right time to intervene." Brandon frowned, still trying to process everything. "Watching over me? Why?" "Because you have something they want," Dr. Rivers explained. "Nathan and his people are ruthless, and they won't stop until they get it. You refused to cooperate, and that's why they left you for dead. But they won't stop there. They'll come after you again." Brandon's mind raced, trying to grasp the gravity of the situation. "What do they want from me?" "Your skills," Eli said, finally speaking up. His voice was rough, like gravel. "They want you to use your financial expertise to launder money for them, cover up their crimes, and keep the authorities off their backs. You refused, and that's why they nearly killed you." Brandon's breath hitched. It all made sense now. Nathan had made cryptic remarks about needing his help, but Brandon had never imagined the extent of their demands. He had assumed it was something minor, perhaps cooking the books to cover up some shady deals. But this was far more sinister. Dr. Rivers placed a hand on Brandon's arm, her touch surprisingly gentle. You need to leave this life behind, Brandon. You can't go back to your old life, not now. They'll come for you again, and next time, they won't leave you alive. I don't understand, Brandon stammered. What do you expect me to do? I can't just disappear. That's exactly what you need to do, Dr. Rivers said firmly. We're going to help you disappear. You'll need a new identity, a new life. Everything you knew before is gone. Brandon's heart pounded in his chest. The thought of leaving everything behind, his home, his job, even his name, was overwhelming. But my job, my friends, everything I've worked for. Eli crossed his arms, his expression stern. You're not listening, kid. Those things don't matter anymore. If you want to live, you need to start over. Dr. Rivers nodded in agreement. We'll help you, Brandon, but you have to trust us. Brandon swallowed hard, his mind racing with uncertainty. He knew they were right. The thought of returning to his old life, knowing that Alexis and Nathan were still out there, plotting against him, was too dangerous. But the idea of leaving everything behind was terrifying. What do I have to do? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Rivers smiled faintly, though her eyes remained serious. First, you'll need a new identity. We'll take care of the paperwork, the details. You'll become someone else. And then, you'll come with us to a place where you can be trained. You'll learn how to defend yourself, how to survive in this new world. Brandon hesitated. Trained? For what? For the fight that's coming, Eli said, his tone grave. They won't stop hunting you, Brandon. You need to be ready. Brandon closed his eyes, trying to steady his breathing. He had no choice. If he wanted to survive, he had to leave everything behind. He had to become someone else. What's my new name? He asked after a long silence. Dr. Rivers exchanged a glance with Eli before answering. Connor Brennan. Connor Brennan. The name felt foreign on his tongue, but it also felt like the beginning of something new. Something dangerous, but necessary. All right, Brandon, no Connor, said finally. I'm in. Over the next few days, Connor's life began to unravel piece by piece. Dr. Rivers and Eli worked swiftly, preparing his new identity, securing new documents, and planning his escape. The hospital stay was grueling, as his body continued to recover from the brutal attack. His face had been reconstructed as best as the surgeons could manage, but he still bore the scars of that fateful night. As Connor lay in his hospital bed, he found himself haunted by dreams, visions of Alexis and Nathan, of violence and betrayal. He couldn't shake the image of Alexis standing over him as Nathan's men beat him senseless. The woman he had loved, the woman he had trusted, had betrayed him in the worst possible way. Dr. Rivers visited him often, bringing him tea and helping him process the trauma. She was an enigmatic figure, always calm and collected, but there was something about her that intrigued Connor. She seemed to know more than she let on, and there was a strength in her that went beyond her small frame. One night, after a particularly vivid nightmare, Connor awoke to find Dr. Rivers sitting by his bed, watching him. Bad dreams? She asked softly. Connor nodded, wiping the sweat from his brow. I keep seeing them. Alexis, Nathan, I don't know if I'll ever be able to forget. You won't, Dr. Rivers said simply, but that's not a bad thing. Those memories will keep you sharp. They'll remind you of what's at stake. Connor stared at her, his mind racing with questions. Who are you? Really? Why are you helping me? Dr. Rivers smiled faintly, her eyes glinting in the dim light. I'm someone who believes in justice, Connor. And I'm someone who sees potential in you. Potential for what? Connor asked, his voice tinged with suspicion. To make things right, she replied. To take back control of your life. You've been wronged, and now you have a chance to fight back. Connor's mind swirled with confusion and anger. He didn't know what to believe anymore. But one thing was clear. Dr. Rivers was offering him a way out, a way to survive. Where do we go from here? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. We leave tomorrow, Dr. Rivers said. Eli will take you to a place where you can train, where you can prepare for what's coming. Wyoming. Wyoming. Connor repeated, confused. What's in Wyoming? Safety, Dr. Rivers replied, "and the training you'll need to survive." The next morning, after what felt like an eternity, Connor was discharged from the hospital. Eli was waiting for him in the lobby, his worn cowboy hat perched on his head, and a look of quiet determination on his face. "Ready?" Eli asked, his voice gruff but kind. Connor nodded, though his stomach churned with anxiety. He had no idea what to expect, but he knew he had no choice. It was either this, or face certain death at the hands of Nathan Bell and his associates. Eli led Connor outside to a waiting car. The drive was long and quiet, the vast expanse of the Colorado plains stretching out before them as they headed toward Wyoming. Connor stared out the window, his mind still struggling to process everything that had happened. After hours of driving, they arrived at a secluded ranch nestled deep in the Wyoming wilderness. It was a sprawling property, surrounded by forests and mountains, far from any signs of civilization. "This is it," Eli said as they pulled up to the main house. "Your new home." Connor stepped out of the car, taking in the vastness of the property. It was peaceful, serene, but there was an undercurrent of tension in the air. This was a place where people came to train, to prepare for battle. As they entered the house, Connor was greeted by a group of men and women, all of them with the same hardened look in their eyes. These were people who had been through hell and back, and now they were ready to fight. "This is where you'll learn," Eli said, leading Connor into a large training room. "You'll train every day, physically and mentally. You'll learn how to defend yourself, how to fight, how to survive." Connor nodded, though his stomach churned with uncertainty. This was a far cry from his old life as a financial analyst. But if he wanted to survive, he had no choice. "Welcome to your new life," Eli said, clapping him on the shoulder. "Connor Brennan." The training was grueling. Every day, Connor pushed his body to the limit, running drills, practicing hand-to-hand combat, and learning how to handle firearms. Eli was a tough but fair instructor, and under his guidance, Connor's body began to change. He grew stronger, faster, and more confident. But it wasn't just physical training. Eli and Dr. Rivers also pushed Connor mentally, forcing him to confront the trauma of his past and the betrayal he had suffered at the hands of Alexis and Nathan. It was painful, but necessary. As the weeks passed, Connor began to feel like a different person. The man he had been, Brandon Hayes, was gone. In his place was Connor Brennan, a man ready to fight for his survival. One night, after an especially brutal day of training, Connor sat outside, staring up at the stars. His body ached, and his mind was heavy with thoughts of what was to come. "You're doing well," a voice said from behind him. Connor turned to see Dr. Rivers standing there, her face illuminated by the moonlight. "Am I?" he asked, his voice filled with doubt. Dr. Rivers nodded, stepping closer. "You're stronger than you think, Connor. You've been through hell, and you've come out the other side." Connor looked down at his hands, the calluses from his training visible even in the dim light. "I don't know if I'm ready for what's coming." "You are," Dr. Rivers said firmly. "You just don't know it yet." Connor stared at her, his mind racing with questions. "Why me?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why did you choose me?" Dr. Rivers smiled faintly, her eyes glinting in the moonlight. "Because you have something that most people don't, the will to survive." Connor swallowed hard, his chest tight with emotion. "And what happens if I fail?" "You won't," Dr. Rivers said, her voice steady. "Because I won't let you." Connor felt a surge of determination rise within him. He wasn't sure if he fully believed her, but in that moment, he wanted to. He wanted to believe that he could survive, that he could fight back against the people who had tried to destroy him. "I'm ready," he said, his voice firm. Dr. Rivers nodded, her expression softening. "Good. Because it's almost time." The weeks of training passed in a blur. Connor's transformation was complete. He was no longer the man who had been beaten and left for dead by Nathan Bell and Alexis. He was stronger, both physically and mentally, and he was ready to take on whatever came next. But the fight wasn't over yet. One day, as Connor was finishing his morning run, Eli approached him, his expression serious. "It's time," Eli said. Connor's heart raced as he realized what that meant. The time had come to confront Nathan and Alexis, to finally get the justice he had been waiting for. Dr. Rivers joined them, her eyes filled with a mix of determination and something else, something that looked almost like pride. "We're going to take them down," she said. "But you need to be ready." Connor nodded, his mind racing with thoughts of what was to come. He had trained for this, prepared for this, but now that the moment was here, he couldn't help but feel a knot of fear in his stomach. "You'll be fine," Eli said, clapping him on the back. "Just remember everything we've taught you." Connor took a deep breath, steadying himself. This was it, the moment he had been waiting for. "Let's do this," he said, his voice filled with resolve. The plan was set. Connor, Dr. Rivers, and Eli would head to Miami, where Nathan Bell and Alexis were hiding out. They had gathered enough evidence to expose their criminal activities, but they needed to act quickly before Nathan could disappear. As they boarded the plane, Connor's mind raced with thoughts of what was to come. He couldn't help but think back to his old life, the life he had left behind, the life that had been destroyed by the people he was now hunting. But there was no turning back now. He was Connor Brennan, and he was ready to fight. The confrontation came faster than Connor had expected. They tracked Nathan and Alexis to a luxurious hotel in Miami, where they were holding a meeting with other members of their criminal network. Connor's heart pounded in his chest as they approached the hotel. He had been trained for this, but the reality of the situation was overwhelming. He was about to face the people who had tried to kill him. Eli and Dr. Rivers were calm, their expressions focused and determined. They had done this before, but for Connor, this was new. This was personal. As they entered the hotel, Connor spotted Alexis across the lobby. She was laughing, completely unaware of what was about to happen. Seeing her like that, so carefree, after everything she had done, made Connor's blood boil. "That's her," Connor said, his voice tight with anger. Dr. Rivers nodded. "It's time." They moved quickly, heading toward the private room where Nathan and Alexis were meeting. Eli took the lead, his hand resting on the gun at his side. When they burst into the room, chaos erupted. Nathan's men reached for their weapons, but Eli was faster, disarming them with ease. Connor's heart raced as he stepped forward, his eyes locked on Nathan. "It's over," Connor said, his voice cold and steady. Nathan sneered, his eyes narrowing. "You think you can just walk in here and take me down? You have no idea who you're dealing with." "I know exactly who I'm dealing with," Connor replied, his voice filled with conviction. "And I'm not afraid of you." Nathan's eyes flicked to Alexis, who stood frozen, her face pale. "You brought this on yourself," Connor said, his voice steady. "You could have stopped this, but you didn't." Alexis said nothing, her eyes wide with fear. Connor took a deep breath, steadying himself. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the moment he had trained for. "You're finished," Connor said, his voice cold and final. "Both of you." The aftermath was a blur. Nathan and Alexis were arrested, along with the rest of their criminal network. Connor watched as they were led away in handcuffs, their faces filled with anger and fear. It was over. Finally, after months of pain and betrayal, it was over. But as Connor stood there, watching the chaos unfold around him, he couldn't help but feel a sense of emptiness. The people who had tried to destroy him were gone, but the scars they had left behind remained. Dr. Rivers approached him, her expression soft. "You did it," she said quietly. Connor nodded, though he didn't feel the sense of victory he had expected. "I did," he said, his voice hollow. Dr. Rivers placed a hand on his arm, her touch gentle. "It's not over yet," she said. "But you've taken the first step." Connor stared at her, his mind swirling with thoughts. She was right. This wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. "I don't know what comes next," Connor admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Rivers smiled faintly. "You'll figure it out. You've come this far, haven't you?" Connor nodded, though the weight of the journey ahead still pressed heavily on him. There was so much he didn't know, so much he wasn't prepared for. But for the first time in months, he felt a glimmer of hope. "I'll be here," Dr. Rivers said, her voice filled with quiet reassurance. "Whatever comes next, I'll be here." Connor looked at her, his chest tight with emotion. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, he felt like he had a chance. A chance to rebuild, a chance to start over, and maybe, just maybe, a chance to find peace. As the sun set over Miami, Connor Brennan stood on the balcony of his hotel room, staring out at the ocean. The weight of everything that had happened pressed down on him, but for the first time in months, he felt like he could breathe. The fight wasn't over, but he had won the first battle. And with Dr. Rivers and Eli by his side, he knew he wouldn't have to face the future alone. Whatever came next, he was ready. Connor Brennan was ready. After the dramatic takedown of Nathan Bell and Alexis Reed, Connor Brennan's life didn't slow down. It only shifted into a new, unpredictable rhythm. The arrests of Nathan and Alexis brought temporary relief, but there was no denying that Connor's life was forever changed. While he had succeeded in stopping the immediate threat, the scars of his past haunted him, both physically and emotionally. The media had a field day with the takedown of Nathan Bell's criminal empire, and although Connor remained anonymous to the public, whispers about a mysterious man helping to bring down the operation circulated in certain circles. But Connor wasn't seeking recognition. He was just trying to reclaim what little peace he could. He had trained for this, fought for this, and now that it was over, he was left with a gnawing sense of emptiness. He had cut ties with his old life as Brandon Hayes, and yet, even with a new name and a new identity, Connor felt the weight of who he used to be. His transformation from a soft-spoken financial analyst to a hardened man capable of taking down dangerous criminals hadn't come without a cost. Connor had lost more than just his marriage and his job. He had lost his innocence, his faith in people, and his belief that the world was a just place. For weeks after Nathan's arrest, Connor tried to settle into a normal routine. He returned to the Wyoming ranch, where Eli Davis and Dr. Emily Rivers continued to guide him. The ranch had become a safe haven, a place where Connor could train, reflect, and try to rebuild himself. The isolation helped, and the physical challenges gave him an outlet for the turmoil inside, but it wasn't enough to drown out the memories. Dr. Rivers visited regularly, offering counsel and guidance. She had a way of pushing Connor just enough to help him grow, without overwhelming him. She was calm, collected, and always seemed to know what he needed, even when he didn't. Her presence was a steadying force in his chaotic life, and over time, Connor found himself relying on her more than he'd expected. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the mountains, casting a warm glow over the ranch, Connor found himself sitting with Dr. Rivers on the porch. The day had been long, filled with grueling physical training and hours spent reviewing evidence that had been collected against Nathan's associates. Despite the exhaustion, Connor's mind was restless. "Do you think it's really over?" Connor asked, breaking the silence. Dr. Rivers glanced at him, her expression thoughtful. "It's never really over, Connor. There will always be something else, someone else. But you've taken the first step." Connor sighed, leaning back in his chair. "I don't know if I can keep doing this. I'm not sure if I'm cut out for it." Dr. Rivers smiled softly. "You're stronger than you think. You've already proven that." "I'm tired," Connor admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I just want some peace. I thought taking down Nathan and Alexis would give me that, but it hasn't." Dr. Rivers didn't respond immediately. Instead, she let the silence settle between them for a moment. Finally, she spoke, her voice gentle. "Peace isn't something that comes from external circumstances, Connor. It comes from within. And right now, you're still carrying the weight of everything you've been through. That's why you can't find peace." Connor stared out at the horizon, the sky painted in shades of pink and orange. He wanted to believe her, but the pain he carried felt too heavy, too deep to ever let go of. "How do I move on from this?" he asked quietly. "You don't move on," Dr. Rivers said softly. "You learn to carry it differently. You learn to live with it, and in time, it becomes a part of you, but it doesn't define you." Connor didn't respond. He wasn't sure if he believed her, but he appreciated that she was there, offering support without judgment. He wasn't used to that kind of unconditional presence. As the weeks passed, Connor's training continued. He focused on his physical conditioning, pushing his body to new limits, but he knew that the real battle was happening in his mind. The memories of what Alexis had done to him, of Nathan's cruel manipulation haunted him. There were nights when he couldn't sleep, when the images of that brutal night replayed in his head over and over again. One particularly restless night, Connor found himself sitting outside the main house, staring up at the stars. The cold Wyoming air bit at his skin, but he didn't care. He needed the cold. It helped him feel something other than the numbness that had taken root inside him. As he sat there, lost in his thoughts, he heard footsteps approaching. He didn't have to turn around to know it was Eli. The older man had a way of moving silently, yet his presence was always unmistakable. "You're up late," Eli remarked, taking a seat beside Connor. "Couldn't sleep," Connor replied, his voice flat. Eli nodded, lighting a cigarette. He took a long drag before speaking. "I get it. Nights are the hardest." Connor glanced at him. "How do you deal with it?" Eli exhaled slowly, the smoke curling into the night air. "You don't. You just learn to live with it. Some nights are worse than others, but eventually, you find a way to make it through." Connor stared at the ground, his hands clenched into fists. "I don't know if I'm strong enough for that." "You are," Eli said, his voice firm. "You've already survived more than most people ever will. You've got the strength, kid. You just need to believe in it." Connor didn't respond. He wasn't sure if he believed Eli, but he appreciated the man's quiet confidence. Eli wasn't one to offer empty platitudes. If he said something, it was because he meant it. The two men sat in silence for a while, the quiet of the night enveloping them. It was a rare moment of peace, and Connor found himself clinging to it, hoping that maybe, just maybe, he could find more moments like this. A few months later, things took an unexpected turn. Connor had been slowly adjusting to his new life, finding a semblance of routine at the ranch. But one day, a phone call shattered the fragile peace he had built. It was Dr. Rivers who broke the news. She had been following up on the remnants of Nathan Bell's criminal network, and what she discovered was troubling. Some of Nathan's associates had slipped through the cracks during the initial wave of arrests, and now they were regrouping, trying to reclaim what they had lost. "They're coming after you, Connor," Dr. Rivers said, her voice grim. "Nathan may be in prison, but his people haven't forgotten about you. They want revenge." Connor felt a chill run down his spine. He had known this day would come, but he had hoped it wouldn't be so soon. He had barely had time to recover from the last battle, and now, another one was looming on the horizon. "What do we do?" Connor asked, his mind racing. "We prepare," Dr. Rivers said. "They're not going to stop until they've taken you down, but we're not going to let that happen." The next few weeks were a blur of planning and preparation. Connor, Eli, and Dr. Rivers worked tirelessly, mapping out every possible scenario, every potential threat. They knew that Nathan's associates would come for Connor with everything they had, and they had to be ready. Connor's training intensified, both physically and mentally. He pushed his body harder than ever before, determined not to be caught off guard. Eli drilled him relentlessly, making sure that Connor was ready for any confrontation that might come his way. But it wasn't just about the physical battle. Connor knew that he needed to be mentally prepared as well. He couldn't afford to let fear or doubt cloud his judgment. He had to stay focused, stay sharp. Dr. Rivers helped him with that, guiding him through exercises designed to strengthen his mind and his resolve. She taught him how to control his emotions, how to stay calm under pressure. It wasn't easy, but Connor was determined to succeed. As the days passed, the tension mounted. They knew that the attack could come at any moment, and the anticipation was almost worse than the fight itself. Connor found himself constantly on edge, his nerves frayed from the constant stress. Then, one night, the attack came. It was late, and the ranch was quiet. Connor had just finished his evening training session and was about to head to bed when he heard a noise outside. His instincts kicked in immediately, and he grabbed the gun that Eli had given him. He moved silently through the house, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew that something was wrong, but he didn't know what. As he reached the front door, he saw movement outside. A group of men, armed and dangerous, were approaching the house. Connor's breath caught in his throat. This was it. This was the moment they had been preparing for. Without hesitation, Connor opened the door and stepped outside, his gun raised. The men stopped in their tracks, surprised to see him standing there. "Don't come any closer," Connor warned, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. The leader of the group, a tall man with a scar running down his face, smirked. "You're a hard man to find, Brennan." Connor tightened his grip on the gun. "What do you want?" "You know what we want," the man replied. "We want payback for what you did to Nathan. You should have stayed in hiding." "I'm not running anymore," Connor said, his voice cold. "If you want me, you're going to have to take me down." The man chuckled darkly. "That's the plan." Before Connor could react, the men charged at him, their guns drawn. Shots rang out, and Connor dove for cover, his heart racing. This was it, the fight for his life. Eli and Dr. Rivers had heard the commotion and rushed to help. Eli was a crack shot, and he took down 2 of the attackers with ease. But more men kept coming. The battle was fierce, and for a moment, Connor wasn't sure if they were going to make it out alive. But he couldn't give up, not now. He had come too far, fought too hard to let them take him down. Connor moved quickly, firing off shots and taking out attackers one by one. His training had prepared him for this, and despite the chaos around him, he remained calm and focused. But then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw one of the attackers moving toward Dr. Rivers. His heart skipped a beat. She was vulnerable, caught off guard by the sudden movement. Without thinking, Connor rushed toward her, his gun raised. He fired a shot just as the attacker raised his weapon, hitting the man square in the chest. The attacker crumpled to the ground, and Dr. Rivers turned to Connor, her eyes wide with shock. "Are you okay?" Connor asked, his voice breathless. Dr. Rivers nodded, still shaken. "Thanks to you." The fight continued for what felt like hours, though in reality, it was only minutes. Eventually, the attackers were either dead or incapacitated, and the ranch fell silent once again. Connor stood there, his chest heaving, his heart still racing. He had survived. They had survived. Eli walked over, clapping Connor on the back. "You did good, kid." Connor nodded, though the reality of what had just happened hadn't fully sunk in yet. He had just taken down a group of men sent to kill him, men who wouldn't have hesitated to end his life if given the chance. Dr. Rivers approached, her face pale but calm. "It's over," she said softly. "You did it." Connor looked at her, his mind still reeling from the adrenaline. "For now," he said, "but they'll be back. Nathan may be gone, but his people won't stop until I'm dead." Dr. Rivers placed a hand on his arm, her touch gentle but firm. "We'll be ready." In the days that followed, Connor tried to process everything that had happened. The attack had been brutal, and the realization that Nathan's associates were still out there, hunting him, weighed heavily on him. But there was also a sense of relief. He had faced the threat head-on and survived. He had proven to himself that he could fight, that he could stand up to the people who wanted him dead. Dr. Rivers continued to offer her support, and Eli remained a constant presence, always ready with advice or a sharp word of encouragement. They had become his family, the people he relied on in this new, dangerous life. One evening, as Connor sat outside, staring up at the stars, Dr. Rivers joined him. She sat down beside him, her presence comforting. "You've come a long way," she said softly. Connor nodded, though he still felt the weight of everything he had been through. "It doesn't feel like it sometimes." Dr. Rivers smiled faintly. "That's because you're still carrying it. But you don't have to carry it alone." Connor glanced at her, his chest tight with emotion. "I don't know if I can let it go." "You don't have to let it go," Dr. Rivers said gently. "You just have to learn to live with it." Connor was silent for a long moment, the weight of her words settling over him. He had been fighting for so long, trying to survive in a world that had been turned upside down. But maybe, just maybe, he could find a way to live again. "I'll try," he said finally, his voice quiet but resolute. Dr. Rivers smiled, her eyes soft. "That's all anyone can ask." Connor turned his gaze back to the stars, the quiet of the night wrapping around him like a comforting blanket. The fight wasn't over. There would always be more battles to face, more enemies to confront. But for the first time in a long time, he felt like he had a chance to rebuild, a chance to find peace, a chance to live. And with Dr. Rivers and Eli by his side, Connor Brennan knew he wouldn't have to face it alone. As time passed, Connor continued to train and prepare for whatever came next. He knew that the world he had entered was dangerous, filled with people who would stop at nothing to take him down. But he also knew that he wasn't the same man he had been before. He was stronger now, both physically and mentally. He had learned to fight, to survive, and to face the darkness head-on. But more importantly, he had learned to trust in himself, in his abilities, and in the people around him. There would always be challenges ahead, but Connor Brennan was ready. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he was in control of his own destiny. And with that knowledge, he could face whatever came his way. Because no matter what happened, no matter who came after him, Connor knew one thing for certain. He was a survivor, and he wasn't going down without a fight. The months that followed the attack on the Wyoming ranch were a whirlwind of activity and emotional upheaval for Connor Brennan. While the immediate threat from Nathan Bell's associates had been dealt with, Connor knew all too well that his journey wasn't over. It had become clear to him that he wasn't merely a target anymore. He was now a player in a larger, more dangerous game. The stakes had risen far beyond the betrayal of his wife or the machinations of a single criminal. There were deeper forces at play, and Connor had no choice but to continue moving forward. Dr. Emily Rivers and Eli Davis remained by his side, a constant source of support, guidance, and training. The bond between them had deepened, forged through shared experiences and the dangerous path they now walked together. Connor was no longer the man who had been left for dead by his wife's treachery. He had transformed into someone harder, more resilient, and capable of facing whatever came next. But with every battle won, new threats seemed to emerge from the shadows. Despite his victory over Nathan Bell and his associates, there were still remnants of the criminal network out there, lurking and waiting for the right moment to strike. More disturbingly, Connor began to hear whispers of something much larger, a powerful and shadowy organization that Nathan had only been a small part of. The more Connor learned, the more he realized that his fight wasn't just about revenge or survival. It was about stopping something that threatened to consume him and everyone around him. One crisp autumn morning, Connor sat at the large wooden table in the ranch's main house, sipping a cup of coffee. The early light filtered through the window, casting a golden glow on the room, but Connor's mind was elsewhere. The peace of the ranch no longer brought him the comfort it once had. He had too many questions, too many unfinished pieces of the puzzle rattling around in his head. Dr. Rivers entered the room, as calm and composed as always. She carried her own cup of tea and sat down across from Connor, her eyes studying him carefully. "You're thinking again," she said, her voice soft but knowing. Connor glanced up at her, a wry smile tugging at his lips. "Aren't I always?" Dr. Rivers sipped her tea before setting the cup down gently. "Not like this. Something's bothering you," he sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It's just, I can't shake the feeling that there's more going on than we know. Nathan and Alexis were part of something bigger, something that's still out there. And I don't know what it is, but I know it's dangerous." Dr. Rivers nodded, her expression serious. "You're right. Nathan's criminal network was only the tip of the iceberg. There are deeper forces at play here, and we've only scratched the surface." "Do you know what we're dealing with?" Connor asked, his eyes searching hers for answers. Dr. Rivers hesitated for a moment before speaking. "I have some theories. There's a powerful organization that's been operating in the shadows for years. They control vast amounts of wealth, power, and influence. Nathan Bell was just one of many pawns in their game." Connor leaned forward, his heart racing. "Who are they?" "They go by many names, but most commonly they're referred to as the Syndicate," Dr. Rivers explained. "They operate through layers of intermediaries and front organizations, making it nearly impossible to trace their activities directly back to them. They're involved in everything: money laundering, arms dealing, political corruption, and even human trafficking." Connor felt a chill run down his spine. He had suspected something like this, but hearing it confirmed was another thing entirely. "So what do we do about it?" Dr. Rivers met his gaze, her expression unwavering. "We stop them." Connor blinked, surprised by the calm certainty in her voice. "That's easier said than done. If they're as powerful as you say, How do we even begin to take them down? Dr. Rivers took a deep breath. It won't be easy, but it's possible. We've already made a dent in their operations by taking down Nathan and his associates. But now, we need to go after the bigger players, the ones who are pulling the strings from behind the scenes. And how do we find them? Connor asked, his mind racing with possibilities. We've been gathering information for months, Dr. Rivers said. Contacts, intelligence, small leads here and there. It's all starting to come together. But there's one person who can give us the key to unraveling the whole thing. Who? Connor asked. A man named Victor Carver, she replied. He was Nathan's handler within the syndicate. If anyone knows how the organization operates, it's him. Connor frowned. And where is he now? Dr. Rivers' expression darkened. That's the problem. He's gone underground. After Nathan's arrest, Carver vanished. But we have reason to believe he's hiding somewhere in Eastern Europe. Connor exhaled sharply. Eastern Europe? That's a long way from here. It is, Dr. Rivers agreed. But we're not the only ones looking for him. The syndicate has put a price on his head. He's a loose end, and they want him gone before he can spill their secrets. So we need to find him before they do, Connor said, understanding the urgency of the situation. Exactly, Dr. Rivers said. We have a few leads, but it's going to be dangerous. The syndicate has eyes and ears everywhere, and they won't hesitate to eliminate anyone who gets in their way. Connor's mind was already racing ahead, formulating a plan. We'll need a team. Eli, of course, but we'll need more help. We can't do this alone. I've already started reaching out to some trusted contacts, Dr. Rivers said, but we'll need to be careful. We don't know who we can trust entirely, and the syndicate has people in high places. Connor nodded, the weight of the task ahead settling on his shoulders. It was daunting, but he had come too far to back down now. If the syndicate was as dangerous as Dr. Rivers said, then stopping them was the only option. When do we leave? Connor asked, his voice steady. Dr. Rivers smiled faintly. Soon. Very soon. The preparations for the mission moved quickly. Dr. Rivers worked tirelessly to secure the resources they needed, while Connor and Eli spent long hours honing their skills, preparing for the unknown challenges they would face. Eastern Europe was a different kind of battleground, one where alliances could shift in an instant and danger lurked around every corner. As the day of their departure approached, Connor couldn't shake the feeling of impending doom. The mission felt larger than anything he had faced before, and the stakes were higher than ever. He tried to keep his mind focused on the task at hand, but the nagging fear that they might not all make it back alive lingered in the back of his mind. One evening, after a particularly intense training session, Connor found himself alone in the stables, brushing down one of the ranch's horses. The repetitive motion of the brush against the horse's coat was soothing, offering him a moment of peace in the midst of the chaos. "Penny for your thoughts," came a voice from the doorway. Connor turned to see Eli leaning against the frame, his usual calm expression in place. Connor smiled faintly. Just thinking about the mission. Eli stepped into the stable, crossing his arms as he leaned against one of the stalls. "You're worried." Connor nodded, not bothering to deny it. "Yeah, I guess I am." Eli studied him for a moment before speaking. "That's not a bad thing, you know? It means you're taking this seriously. But don't let it paralyze you. You've faced worse odds before, and you've come out the other side." Connor exhaled sharply, setting the brush down. "I know. It's just, this feels different. The syndicate, they're not like anything we've dealt with before." "No, they're not," Eli agreed. "But you've got something they don't." Connor raised an eyebrow. "And what's that?" "People who've got your back," Eli said simply. "You're not in this alone, Connor. We're a team. Dr. Rivers, me, the contacts we've brought in, we're all in this together. And together, we stand a damn good chance." Connor smiled, the tension in his chest easing slightly. "Thanks, Eli." Eli shrugged, his usual nonchalant demeanor returning. "Just telling it like it is, kid. Now, get some rest. Tomorrow's going to be a long day." Connor nodded, watching as Eli left the stable. He returned to brushing the horse, feeling a renewed sense of determination. Eli was right. He wasn't alone in this fight, and as long as they stood together, they had a chance. The mission began with a flight to Prague, a city that had long been a hub for espionage, intrigue, and shadowy dealings. It was a place where the line between right and wrong often blurred, and trust was a rare commodity. Connor, Dr. Rivers, and Eli landed in the city under the cover of night, using false identities and forged passports to avoid detection. From Prague, they would begin their search for Victor Carver, following a trail of breadcrumbs that led through the murky underworld of Eastern Europe. Dr. Rivers had made contact with a former intelligence officer, a woman named Nadia, who had connections in the region and could help guide them through the complex web of criminal networks that operated there. Nadia was waiting for them when they arrived at a small safe house on the outskirts of the city. She was a tall, slender woman with sharp features and a no-nonsense attitude. Her eyes were cold, calculating, and Connor could tell immediately that she was someone who had seen more than her fair share of danger. "Welcome to Prague," Nadia said as they entered the safe house. "I hope you're ready for what's ahead." "We are," Dr. Rivers replied, her tone confident. "Do you have any leads on Carver's whereabouts?" Nadia nodded, pulling out a map of the region and spreading it across the table. "Carver's been laying low, but we've managed to track some of his movements. He's been seen in a few different places, mostly small towns and rural areas, places where he thinks he can disappear. But we have reason to believe he's heading for a safe house in Romania. It's well protected, and it's where he's likely to regroup with some of his remaining allies." Connor studied the map, tracing the route with his finger. "How long do we have before he gets there?" "Not long," Nadia said. "If we move quickly, we can intercept him before he reaches the safe house. But once he's inside, it'll be much harder to get to him." Eli crossed his arms, frowning. "What kind of resistance are we looking at?" Nadia's expression darkened. "The safe house is heavily guarded, and Carver's men are well trained. We'll need to be careful." "We've handled worse," Eli said, his voice steady. "We'll be ready." Dr. Rivers glanced at Connor, her expression unreadable. "Are you ready for this?" Connor nodded, his jaw set in determination. "I am. Let's get it done." The journey to Romania was tense, filled with moments of uncertainty and danger. They traveled in an unmarked van, using back roads and avoiding major highways to stay off the syndicate's radar. Nadia led the way, her knowledge of the region proving invaluable as they navigated through rural villages and dense forests. As they drew closer to their target, the tension in the group heightened. They knew that once they reached the safe house, there would be no turning back. It was a dangerous mission, one that could easily cost them their lives if things went wrong. But Connor was ready. He had come too far to back down now. They arrived at the outskirts of the safe house under the cover of night. The building itself was a nondescript cabin, tucked away in the dense woods. But as Nadia had warned, it was heavily guarded. Armed men patrolled the perimeter, and Connor could see the faint glint of security cameras hidden among the trees. Nadia pulled out a pair of binoculars, scanning the area. "There are at least 10 guards outside, possibly more inside. We'll need to be fast and precise if we want to get to Carver." Dr. Rivers nodded, her expression calm and focused. "We'll split into 2 teams. Nadia, you and Eli take the left flank. Connor and I will take the right. Once we're inside, we'll regroup and find Carver." Connor's heart raced as they prepared for the assault. This was it, the moment they had been preparing for. The mission that could bring them one step closer to stopping the syndicate. "Ready?" Dr. Rivers asked, her eyes meeting his. Connor nodded, his grip tightening on his weapon. "Let's do this." The assault on the safe house was swift and brutal. Connor moved through the shadows with precision, taking down guards with deadly efficiency. His training had prepared him well, and despite the danger, he remained calm and focused. Dr. Rivers was right beside him, her movements fluid and controlled as she neutralized the threats in their path. Together, they pushed deeper into the safe house, clearing room after room as they searched for Victor Carver. As they reached the heart of the building, they found Carver holed up in a secure office, surrounded by his remaining guards. The room was fortified, but they had come too far to turn back now. Connor and Dr. Rivers exchanged a glance, and without a word, they breached the door. The final confrontation was intense, with bullets flying and shouts echoing through the air. But in the end, it was Connor who stood over Victor Carver, his gun trained on the man who held the key to everything. Carver looked up at him, fear flickering in his eyes. "You don't know what you're getting into," he spat. Connor's voice was cold as ice. "Tell me everything." In the aftermath of the mission, Connor stood in the clearing outside the safe house, the cool night air filling his lungs. The fight was over, but the war was far from won. Victor Carver had given them the information they needed: names, locations, details of the syndicate's operations. It was a major victory, but Connor knew that this was only the beginning. The syndicate was vast, and taking it down would be a long and dangerous journey. Dr. Rivers approached him, her expression soft. "You did well, Connor." He nodded, his mind still racing with everything that had happened. "It's not over yet." "No," she agreed, "but we're one step closer." Connor looked out at the darkened forest, the weight of the future settling on his shoulders. There would be more battles, more challenges, but for the first time, he felt like they had a real chance. A chance to stop the syndicate, a chance to finally find peace. And as long as Dr. Rivers and Eli were by his side, Connor Brennan knew he was ready for whatever came next. The days that followed were filled with debriefings, analysis, and strategizing. Victor Carver's information was invaluable, and it provided them with a roadmap to begin dismantling the syndicate piece by piece. It wasn't going to be easy. There were powerful people involved, and they wouldn't go down without a fight. But Connor, Dr. Rivers, and Eli were determined to see it through. They weren't just fighting for themselves anymore. They were fighting to take down a criminal empire that had caused untold suffering to countless people. And they weren't alone. With each passing day, more allies joined their cause, each bringing their own skills and resources to the table. But even as they moved forward with their plans, Connor couldn't shake the feeling that there was still something lurking in the shadows, something they hadn't yet uncovered. The syndicate was vast, and it was clear that they had only scratched the surface. One evening, as they gathered around a table in their safe house, Dr. Rivers laid out the next steps. They had leads on several high-ranking members of the syndicate, and they were preparing to move on them in the coming days. But as they discussed their plans, Nadia, who had been listening quietly, suddenly spoke up. "There's something you need to know," she said, her voice low and serious. Connor and the others turned to her, sensing the gravity of her words. "What is it?" Dr. Rivers asked. Nadia hesitated for a moment before continuing. "There's someone else, someone higher up in the syndicate than anyone we've dealt with so far. They call him the Ghost. He's the one who's really pulling the strings. And if you want to take down the syndicate for good, you'll need to find him." "The Ghost?" Connor repeated, frowning. "Who is he?" "No one knows for sure," Nadia said. "He's elusive, never shows his face, never leaves a trace. But he's the one in charge. And if you can find him, you can bring the syndicate to its knees." Connor exchanged a glance with Dr. Rivers, his mind racing with this new revelation. It was clear that their fight was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. And now, they had a new target. The Ghost. The man who could end it all, or destroy everything. Connor's jaw tightened with resolve. Whatever it took, whoever he had to face, he would see this through to the end. Because this wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about justice. And Connor Brennan was ready to fight. Connor Brennan stood on the balcony of a safe house overlooking the sprawling city below. The night air was cool, but the tension inside him kept him from feeling any of it. In the weeks since their last mission in Romania, life had taken on a new intensity. The syndicate was reeling from the damage they had inflicted, but it was far from over. They had peeled back the layers of the organization, but the core, the true power behind the syndicate, remained hidden. And now they had a name, the Ghost. He still remembered the conversation with Nadia when she revealed the existence of this elusive figure. The Ghost wasn't just another high-ranking member of the syndicate. He was the architect of their entire operation. Every criminal enterprise, every corrupt official, every trafficking ring, it all tied back to him. The Ghost was the one who pulled the strings, orchestrating the vast web of crime and power that spanned continents. And until they found him, the syndicate would never truly be defeated. Connor had spent weeks poring over the information Victor Carver had given them, trying to trace the Ghost's movements, but it was like chasing a shadow. Every lead, Every connection led to a dead end. Whoever the ghost was, he had covered his tracks so well that even the most sophisticated intelligence agencies in the world couldn't pin him down. But Connor wasn't ready to give up. Not now. Not after everything they had sacrificed to get this far. He heard footsteps behind him and turned to see Dr. Emily Rivers approaching. She had been his rock throughout this entire journey, calm, collected, and always ready with a plan. But even she seemed weary, the weight of the battle showing in the lines of her face. "Any updates?" she asked, her voice steady despite the exhaustion that must have been setting in. Connor shook his head, frustration bubbling just beneath the surface. "Nothing. It's like he doesn't exist. Whoever this guy is, he's good. Really good." Dr. Rivers nodded, leaning on the railing next to him. "He's had years to perfect his methods. The ghost has been in the shadows for a long time, and he knows how to stay hidden." Connor clenched his fists, the muscles in his jaw tightening. "But we can't stop now. We're so close. If we can find him, we can take down the syndicate for good." "We will," Dr. Rivers said, her voice filled with quiet determination. "We just need to keep pushing. Something will give." Connor took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm of emotions raging inside him. He had been through so much, betrayed by his wife, nearly killed by Nathan Bell, hunted by the syndicate's assassins, and yet here he was, still standing. But the cost had been high, and he knew that this final confrontation with the ghost would be the most dangerous yet. "Do you ever wonder if it's all worth it?" Connor asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Rivers looked at him, her eyes softening. "Every day. But then I think about all the lives we've saved, all the people we've helped. That's what makes it worth it." Connor nodded, though the doubt still lingered in the back of his mind. He wanted to believe it was worth it, that all the pain and sacrifice had a purpose. But there were moments when the weight of it all threatened to crush him. Before either of them could say anything more, the door to the balcony swung open, and Eli Davis stepped out, his usual calm demeanor replaced with a sense of urgency. "We've got something," he said, his voice low but intense. Connor and Dr. Rivers immediately straightened, their attention focused entirely on Eli. "What is it?" Connor asked, his heart racing. Eli handed them a tablet, the screen displaying a detailed map with several locations highlighted. Nadia's contacts came through. They've traced a series of high-level communications between syndicate operatives. One of them mentioned a meeting with someone they referred to as the architect. It matches the pattern we've been following for the ghost. Connor's pulse quickened. "Where?" "Berlin," Eli said. "They've been using a series of safe houses there to coordinate their operations. It looks like the ghost is making a rare appearance, probably to deal with the fallout from our attacks." Dr. Rivers scanned the map, her expression calculating. "This could be our chance. If we can intercept him there, we can end this." Connor's mind was already racing, formulating a plan. "We need to move fast. If he gets wind that we're coming, he'll disappear again." Eli nodded. "I'll get the team ready. We leave within the hour." The flight to Berlin was tense, the weight of the impending mission hanging heavy in the air. Connor, Dr. Rivers, Eli, and Nadia had assembled a small but highly skilled team of operatives, former military, intelligence agents, and hackers, each handpicked for their expertise. They knew this wasn't going to be easy. The ghost's safe houses would be heavily guarded, and if the ghost was truly there, they would be walking into the most dangerous operation they had ever undertaken. As the plane touched down in Berlin, Connor felt the adrenaline begin to surge through his veins. This was it, the final confrontation. The ghost had been in the shadows for too long, but now they had a chance to bring him into the light. They moved quickly, setting up a temporary base in an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city. Nadia had secured detailed intelligence on the safe house where the ghost was believed to be staying. It was located in an affluent part of Berlin, hidden behind layers of security and surrounded by syndicate operatives. Getting in would be difficult, but they had a plan. Connor stood with Dr. Rivers and Eli, reviewing the final details of the operation. "The safe house is here," Nadia said, pointing to the map on the table. "It's a heavily fortified building, but we've identified weak points in their perimeter security. If we time it right, we can breach the building without triggering alarms." "And what about the ghost?" Connor asked, his voice steady despite the nerves gnawing at him. Nadia glanced at him, her expression serious. He's there, but we don't know exactly where in the building. Once we're inside, we'll have to move fast to locate him before he has a chance to escape. Connor nodded. It was a good plan, but there were still 100 things that could go wrong. The syndicate had resources, and they wouldn't go down without a fight. We'll split into 2 teams, Dr. Rivers said, taking charge. Connor, Eli, and I will breach the main building. Nadia, you lead the second team and cover the perimeter. If things go sideways, we need to cut off all escape routes. Everyone nodded in agreement. They were ready. Let's finish this, Connor said, his voice filled with determination. The night of the operation arrived quickly. The streets of Berlin were quiet, but there was an undercurrent of tension in the air. The team moved in silence, using the cover of darkness to approach the syndicate's safe house. Connor's heart pounded in his chest as they reached the perimeter of the building. Nadia had been right. The security was tight, but not impenetrable. With careful precision, they disabled the outer defenses, moving quietly toward the building's entrance. Eli was the first to breach the door, his movements smooth and controlled. Connor and Dr. Rivers followed close behind, their weapons drawn, ready for whatever waited inside. The interior of the building was eerily quiet, the dim lighting casting long shadows across the walls. Connor's senses were on high alert as they moved through the hallways, clearing rooms as they went. So far, they had encountered minimal resistance, but he knew that wouldn't last. As they approached the main staircase, they heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Connor motioned for the team to take cover, his pulse quickening as the footsteps grew louder. A moment later, a group of syndicate guards appeared, their weapons at the ready. Connor didn't hesitate. In one fluid motion, he stepped out of cover and fired, taking down 2 of the guards before they had a chance to react. Eli and Dr. Rivers followed suit, neutralizing the remaining guards in a matter of seconds. "Clear," Eli muttered, his eyes scanning the hallway for any additional threats. Connor's heart was racing, but there was no time to dwell on it. They had to keep moving. The ghost was somewhere in this building, and every second that passed was a chance for him to escape. They reached the upper levels of the building, where the walls were lined with heavy steel doors. This was where the ghost would be hiding, behind layers of security and locked doors. Nadia's voice crackled over the comms. "We've got movement outside. Looks like reinforcements are on the way. You need to move fast." Connor cursed under his breath. They didn't have much time. Eli stepped forward, examining the steel doors. "These are reinforced. It's going to take time to get through." Dr. Rivers knelt down beside one of the doors, her fingers moving swiftly over the electronic lock. "I can bypass the security, but it's going to take a minute." Connor kept his weapon raised, his eyes scanning the hallway for any signs of movement. They were running out of time. The ghost could be on the other side of one of these doors, but if they didn't move quickly, they might never find him. Finally, with a soft beep, the lock disengaged. The door swung open, revealing a dimly lit room beyond. Connor's breath caught in his throat as he stepped inside. There, standing in the center of the room, was a man. He was tall, his features obscured by the shadows, but there was no mistaking the aura of power that surrounded him. The ghost. The man turned to face them, a cold smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "So, you finally found me." Connor's grip tightened on his weapon. "It's over." The ghost chuckled softly, the sound sending a chill down Connor's spine. "Over? Oh no. This is just the beginning." Before Connor could react, the ghost moved with lightning speed, disappearing into the shadows. A moment later, the sound of gunfire erupted and chaos descended. The room was plunged into darkness as the lights were cut, and Connor could hear the shouts of syndicate operatives closing in. His heart raced as he ducked behind cover, firing off shots in the direction of the attackers. "Stay low," Eli shouted, his voice barely audible over the cacophony of gunfire. Connor's mind raced as he tried to process what was happening. The ghost was here, but he had slipped away again. They were so close, he couldn't let him escape now. Through the chaos, Connor caught sight of a door at the far end of the room. He could see a figure moving toward it, the ghost, making his escape. Without thinking, Connor bolted from his cover, dodging gunfire as he sprinted toward the door. He reached it just as the ghost was about to disappear through the threshold. Connor lunged forward, grabbing the ghost by the shoulder and slamming him against the wall. The man let out a grunt of pain, but his cold smile never wavered. "You're too late," the ghost hissed, his eyes glinting with malice. "You can't stop this." Connor's jaw clenched, his grip tightening on the ghost's collar. "Watch me." With a swift movement, Connor delivered a hard punch to the ghost's jaw, knocking him unconscious. The man slumped to the ground, and Connor exhaled a shaky breath. It was over. The room fell silent as the last of the syndicate operatives were neutralized. Eli and Dr. Rivers approached, their faces grim but relieved. "You got him," Eli said, his voice filled with a mixture of disbelief and admiration. Connor nodded, his heart still racing. "Yeah, I got him." Dr. Rivers knelt beside the ghost, checking his pulse. "He's alive. We can bring him in." Connor leaned against the wall, his body trembling with exhaustion and adrenaline. They had done it. The ghost was captured, and with him, the key to bringing down the syndicate. But even as the relief washed over him, Connor couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The ghost had said as much. The syndicate was vast, and while they had struck a major blow, there were still more battles to be fought. Still, for the first time in what felt like forever, Connor allowed himself a moment of hope. They had come so far, and now, they were closer than ever to bringing the syndicate to its knees. As they prepared to leave the safe house, the ghost unconscious in tow, Connor glanced at Dr. Rivers. "Do you think this will be enough?" he asked quietly. Dr. Rivers met his gaze, her expression thoughtful. "It's a start." Connor nodded, feeling the weight of her words. It was a start, but it wasn't the end. There was still work to be done. But with the ghost in their custody, they had a chance, a real chance, to dismantle the organization that had caused so much pain and suffering. And for the first time in a long time, Connor Brennan felt like the future was within reach. The aftermath of the mission was a blur of debriefings, intelligence gathering, and planning. The ghost was taken into custody, and his capture sent shockwaves through the syndicate's ranks. Operatives were arrested, assets were seized, and for the first time in years, the syndicate was on the defensive. Connor, Dr. Rivers, Eli, and Nadia continued to work tirelessly, using the information they had gathered to track down the remaining members of the syndicate. It was a long and arduous process, but with each passing day, they made progress. There were still battles to be fought, still shadows lurking in the corners of the criminal world, but Connor knew they had turned the tide. The syndicate was crumbling, and soon it would fall. As Connor stood on the balcony of their latest safe house, watching the sunrise over the city, he felt a sense of peace that had eluded him for so long. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time, he felt like they were winning. Dr. Rivers joined him, her presence a comforting reminder of how far they had come. "What's next?" Connor asked, his voice soft. Dr. Rivers smiled faintly. "Whatever we want it to be." Connor nodded, his heart swelling with a sense of purpose. The future was uncertain, but it was theirs to shape. And whatever came next, Connor Brennan knew he was ready. Because he had survived the darkness. He had fought his way through the shadows. And now, he stood in the light, stronger than ever. Whatever battles lay ahead, he wouldn't face them alone. And together, they would win.